Today, as we continue our study of 1 Samuel, what we're going to see is that David is still on the run from Saul. And we're just going to get right into it today. As I said, we're kind of doing a mini sermon series within a sermon series. And if you have a Bible and would like to follow along, we're going to hone our attention onto 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 through 5 today. Really short passage. Hear the word of God. David left there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and all of his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400. David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. He said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother come to you until I know that God will do for me." He left them with the king of Moab and then stayed with them all that time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Leave and get up and go into the land of Judah." So David left and went into the forest of Hereth. For the past few weeks, we've been unpacking Saul's jealousy over David's success and popularity. It became toxic. In fact, it became so toxic that Saul wasn't going to rest until David was literally dead. Once David became aware of this plan, thanks to Jonathan, once David became fully aware of Saul's murderous intentions, he fled. And David didn't just run away to one place, he fled to a variety of locations. Those of you who are here in worship might be able to see this map that I've posted on our PowerPoint screens. This is a map that shows all of the places that David ran away to as he's trying to escape Saul. I can share this with you later if you can't see it. It's kind of small, but if you look closely, we know that there's about 15 different sites that David ran away to. His journey began in Gibeah, which was where Saul's home was. From Gibeah, David went to Samuel at Naioth and Ramah. But soon Saul sought him there, and so David fled back to Gibeah to meet with Jonathan. After Jonathan warned David of Saul's determination to kill him, he fled to Nob, the city of Nob, and then he went to the city of Gath. And then finally today he goes to two places, the cave of Adullam and the forest of Hereth. Last week, we talked about how David's escape from Saul was motivated, at least in part, by a desire to avoid conflict. And like David, a lot of us have this desire to avoid conflict to whatever capacity that we can. It's hard. It's not fun. It's something, at least personally, makes me feel nervous. It makes me feel anxious, stressed, sometimes even physically sick. Conflict is uncomfortable. Conflict hurts. But as we saw from David's example, the destruction brought about by avoiding a conflict is often many times worse than the unpleasantness that might have resulted from dealing with the issues when they first arose. And this became especially clear as we looked at an example from 2 Samuel, still looking at David's life just later on down the road. We read that there was this major conflict within his family, and it ultimately led to a bloody an unnecessary civil war. But David's conflict with Saul and his inability to deal with that conflict wasn't the only thing that motivated him. To be sure, David was also motivated by a fear of Saul. And I think it's safe to say that David's fear was legitimate, right? Saul held all of the positional power at this point. Yes, David had been anointed as the next king, but he had not been brought into that position at this point in the narrative. Saul is still king. He has the military on his side. He has all the power on his side. He is still the king of Israel. Had God not been on David's side, then Saul would surely have obliterated David. Thanks to God, David did have God on his side. It's interesting, as you go through the Psalms, reading especially the Psalms of David, you can look at the top of the various Psalms, and oftentimes they're just a description of what was taking place in David's life as he wrote that. We know for sure that there were two Psalms that he wrote while positioned in this cave of Adullam. And he writes about his fear, particularly his fear of Saul. These come from Psalm 57 and Psalm 142. Psalm 57 verse 4 says, I lie down among lions that greedily devour human prey. Their teeth are spears and arrows, their tongues sharp as swords. I think most of us would agree that we've had lions in our lives before. Terrifying. David also says in Psalm 142 verse 4, look on my right hand and see there is no one who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for me. Fear can do that too, right? Not only are you gazing whatever scares you right in the face, fear can drag you into dark places where you feel like there is no more hope. You see, David's fear was visceral. I really like that word. It kind of gets overused in our culture, but I think in the right context, it's an important word. It really means that you feel something deep in your gut, and that's how David's fear was manifesting. As was true of conflict, that kind of fear, visceral fear, is so uncomfortable and so unsettling that we do whatever we possibly can to run away from it. We talked about the fight or flight response last week, right? Fear causes that same kind of response that conflict does. We either fight it or run away from it. Today we're talking specifically about running away from it. I'm reminded of a hospital visit that I did a few years ago for one of our church members. They had just had surgery at one of the older hospitals here in Denver, and it's a hospital that's really, quite honestly, starting to show its age. And its elevators are particularly sketchy. So I know this about this hospital. I don't like going to this hospital for that very reason. I don't have a fear of elevators, at least that I'm aware of, but the thought of getting stuck in one is absolutely terrifying. So the elevators are rickety. Every time you ride up, they shake, they take their sweet time. And so I'm there at the hospital, staring at the elevator, and start to wonder, okay, what am I going to do right now? I feel my heart rising. I feel that I'm afraid. I say to myself, why are you so afraid, Matt? It's just an elevator. I'm sure they're tested regularly. After motivating myself for a few more seconds, I got into the elevator. I pressed the button to the 4th floor. The door shut, and then nothing. Not up, not down. The doors wouldn't open. I was stuck. And with that realization, my already anxious heart began to beat even faster. I have an Apple Watch, and so I can track my heart rate, and I was just watching my heart rate go up and up and up on my watch. That's kind of a curse, I think. The air began to feel heavy. Those of you who are claustrophobic know what that's like. Like you can't breathe. Like maybe you're about to hyperventilate. Your vision narrows in. The walls of the elevator start to feel like they're closing in. So I closed my eyes. I began to pray, oh God, please get me out of here. And just like that, the doors open. Now, that felt like a lifetime to me in the moment. I'm sure it lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. It was enough time, though, to make me feel absolutely terrified. And once I got out of the elevator, I had a decision to make. Either I was going to try it again to get up to the 4th floor, or I was going to leave for the day and try it again the next day because I couldn't handle it again. So that's what I did. I left. I ran away from the situation. I determined to go back to the hospital the following day. Of course, fears come in all shapes and sizes, right? Some are reasonable. Some aren't reasonable. Some are crippling. Some fears are just minor nuisances. I think I've shared with you before that Krista has a phobia of needles. And a phobia is really kind of an unreasonable fear, but to her, it's very real. She's had to deal with this since she was a kid. Even the mere thought of a needle, sorry, Krista, I know you're watching this at home. She's probably getting woozy at home right now, just hearing me say this. Imagine having to give blood for Krista. Imagine being pregnant and having to do routine blood panels. Her phobia is so bad that a few months ago, for her first prenatal appointment, you had to do this huge blood panel where they take actually quite a bit of blood. And so we have this routine that we've developed over the years where if we know that she has to go to the lab, we'll ask for, there's a room at the office that we go to with a seat that lies down. So we always ask for the back room. We always ask for her to lie down. We always ask for a cold compress and one of those little blue juices that they have at those kinds of offices. So I am explaining to the phlebotomist, hey, my wife really needs these things because if not, she's going to pass out. She is going to pass out. The phlebotomist was young, I think perhaps maybe a little inexperienced, and he looked at us and almost rolled his eyes, thinking that we were being just crazy. So he has her lie down, has a hard time finding the vein that he needed to go into, and Krista's just not having it. He says, well, it might actually be easier for you to sit up. So she sits up, and immediately, right after sitting up, you just see her eyes roll into the back of her head, and she just about passes out. In fact, I think she did pass out momentarily. That's a phobia, right? That's a fear in its extreme, and some of us have those kinds of fears. Some of us have more minor fears. Either way, fear has the potential to affect each one of us in big ways, in negative ways. But this morning, I want to focus our attention in on the ways that fears affect us relationally. If we're talking about friendship, if we're talking about relationships, if we're talking about intimacy, then we have to recognize that there are a lot of fears that affect the way that we relate to one another. You see, the reason that I've come to this mini sermon series this past week is because I've just been so impressed by God, recognizing that our God is fundamentally a relational God. As such, it follows that we as creatures made in the image of God are wired for intimacy, both with God and other humans. Unfortunately, the power of sin, and I'm not just talking about our individual sins, I'm talking about ontological sin. I'm talking about what the Bible describes as a force and a power in this world. It's a malignancy that prevents us from experiencing the depth of relational intimacy that we were made for. Conflict. And our inability to deal with conflict is just one way that sin plays out in our lives, just one of the many issues that prevents us from going deeper with one another. But as we see here, as David is running from place to place to place, trying his best to get away from Saul, we also know that fear has the potential to prevent us from experiencing relational intimacy. And no, when we hear the word fear, our minds immediately think of things like heights and bugs, closed spaces, dark. I said bugs, and I saw a few of you nodding your head. Yep. Snakes, those kinds of things. Those are all things we can see, though, right? Things that are tangible. Relational fears are just as real and just as important to think about, though we aren't always aware that they exist simply because they aren't as tangible as those other kinds of fears. But just because we can't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. Think about it. Think about all the kinds of fears that might affect your relationship with your spouse, or your relationship with your kids, or your relationship if you're a teacher with your students, or your coworkers, or your neighbors, your extended family members, friends, church members. There's so many of them. There's the fear of not being accepted for who you really are. The fear of being rejected, of not being understood, of being judged, of failure, of change, of loneliness and loss. And that's not an exhaustive list. Those are just a few of the fears that might affect us relationally. Though we might not always be aware of it, these kinds of fears often lurk beneath the surface and prevent us from fully knowing and being fully known by each other. I know all of you are tired of hearing about COVID-19. I'm tired of hearing about COVID-19, but I wanted to share with you that during the lockdown, my life slowed down just enough that I was able to do a lot of self-reflection. I really haven't slowed down that much since, well, maybe never. I graduated from high school. I immediately entered into college. I did a full slew of summer courses almost every year I was in college. Then immediately after I graduated from college, Krista and I got married. 2 weeks after I got married to Krista, I entered into seminary. I was in seminary for 6 years, all the while I was working here part-time and then full-time. My life had not slowed down at all until quarantine. So for many people, quarantine was terrible. For me, it was a time to reflect and to get to know myself a little bit. And during that process, I began to feel that something was wrong. I couldn't quite pinpoint what that something was. I just knew that things were off, that there were parts of my life and parts of myself that felt so unsatisfying. I felt restless. I felt angry. I felt worried and disconnected. I'm not a napper. I don't nap a lot. I can't. But during quarantine, even through the summer months after quarantine was over, I was napping nearly every day. And I don't remember what the content of all these dreams were, but I was having negative dreams. Something was off. And it's taken a lot of hard work over the past few months, especially the past few weeks, for me to figure out what was actually going on beneath the surface of my life. What was causing those feelings of existential dread? And I can say to you now that it was all really motivated by a fear of loss. Let me explain a little bit further. To know me well, one of the things you have to know about my personal experiences is that when I was fairly young, I experienced, as many of you have in your own lives, a series of losses, difficult losses. My dad's mom died after a long and painful battle with cancer when I was 12. I think she spent 4 or 5 months in hospice, and it was not good. The following year, my mom's dad died, unexpectedly. He had been dealing with some bleeding issues, and he got rushed to the hospital one day. The doctor said, if we do a transfusion, he'll live, and he said, nope. Passed away later that day. The following year, my dad's dad died. He had undergone open heart surgery and just never recovered from it. The following year, my junior year of high school, my mom's mom died, also of cancer. All 4 of my grandparents died within a span of 4 years. And at some point along the way, I realized that the pain of loss was more than I wanted to deal with. So I started to build walls. Unintentionally, right? Nobody ever sets out to say, hey, I'm going to start blocking people out of my life from getting to know me. But you start to build walls. It's not that I stopped being friends with people or being friendly. It's not that I stopped loving people. It's just that I developed an aversion to emotional intimacy, an aversion from letting people get to know the real me, because the pain of losing that person is too much. Might as well not connect with them in that way. My fear of loss, that's my fear. Your fear might be different, but the pervading fear in my life is the fear of loss. That causes me to shut down and to shut off. Most of you who are here in person or who are watching online have been at least to one funeral that I have officiated, and you probably know that at most funerals that I officiate, I read a quote from C.S. Lewis. This might as well be my life quote because it describes me almost perfectly. You might be able to even remember it as I read it. Those of you who have been to a lot of funerals, you'll be very familiar. This is what it says. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, in that safe, dark, motionless, airless place, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. Because to love it all is to be vulnerable. To love it all is to open ourselves, to open those places, to break down those walls so that people can know us and so that we can know them. But again, I'm the kind of person that is so afraid of having my heart broken that I hide in that dark, motionless, airless place more than I would ever like to admit. Just being really vulnerable with you, I feel that I've been talking a lot about my personal life these past few weeks, and I'll continue to do that today because if you can see how this plays out in my life, I think that it'll help you perhaps begin to recognize how it plays out in your own life. And what I want to share with you today is that this unfortunate tendency has been problematic at several different points in my marriage with Krista. Last week I talked to you about cleaning and our struggles with learning how to live in the tension of me being a clean nut and Krista living her life in piles. In a lot of ways, that's the least of our worries. You see, Krista is the kind of person that absolutely thrives when she's deeply connected to other people, not just surfacey, but deeply connected to other people. She doesn't want to talk to you about the weather. She wants to talk to you about your struggles and your hopes. So when I shut down and shut off, I cut off her connection to me. And not only does that disrupt our relationship with each other, it also brings her down. It prevents her from living her life to the fullest. So that's the situation I found myself in quarantine during the pandemic. We had been, never spent that much time together in an enclosed space, probably since before we got married. But for whatever reason, I was dealing with my fear of loss, so I had stopped letting Krista into my life. This caused other tensions to grow, other problems to develop. We were drifting apart, and we weren't even aware of it. I can look back now and tell you that this is exactly why I was feeling so dissatisfied with my life, why I felt that something was going on but didn't know what it was. There was something going on. If you had asked us at the time, in fact, if you had asked us 2 weeks ago before we began this process, both Chris and I would have said, our marriage is really good. And at that point, it was really good. But our disconnect was growing to the point that we could have just as easily started down a path of a not-so-good marriage. We weren't on the rocks, but I think in some ways we could have been headed that way. And so things finally came to the surface a few weeks ago. Both of us had an epiphany, an aha moment in which we realized things weren't necessarily as healthy as we assumed. We knew that we needed to do some hard work to reconnect. It reminds me a little bit of Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, the end of the poem that says, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That's where we were in our marriage. We were faced with 2 roads. The first road was the same road we had been traveling down for 10 years of marriage. It was a path towards a good marriage at best and a failed marriage at the worst. But the second road, the road less traveled by, was a new road, a road of deeper intimacy, a road that would lead us into a great marriage. So we began to process through all this. We began to deal with our fears, my fear of loss, Krista's own fears, and we began to process practically what it would look like for us to start to walk down that new road together. And as we did that, I was reminded of 1 John 4 that says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. I know I've been maybe even a little too transparent with you about some of these things over the past few weeks. Part of that's just because it's been something that my personal life has been very devoted to. But I also share it with you because that hard work has been so incredibly worth it. I don't know that I have ever felt so connected to my wife in my life. It's almost like we're back in high school again. During the first few months that we started dating, I find myself feeling Twitter-pated. So sad to see her leave for work in the morning, and our boys are having a really tough time with that too. I told her, you have 3 people who are in your home who are dealing with separation anxiety. And I'm so excited to see her at the end of the day. But I can tell you with 100% transparency, just being more transparent, this isn't something that happens automatically. It's happening because we are intentionally dealing with our conflict. It's happening because we're intentionally addressing our fears. Instead of running away from conflict and fear, we have been exposing both and going to war with them head on. The process has been hard, sometimes painfully so, but it has been so utterly worth it. I opened this window into my own life, partially because Krista said, I want you to be more vulnerable with other people. So here you go. Here's Matt trying to break down his walls. But I also opened this window into my own life because I'm fairly certain that some of you might be experiencing a lack of intimacy in your own relationships. Whether it's in your relationship with your spouse or your kids or another family member, a friend or a coworker. Like me, you might sense that something is wrong, but you can't quite pinpoint what that something is. And if that's the case, I want to encourage you to begin the process of reflecting on why you feel that way. There's a legend in Greek mythology that the oracle at Delphi had a sign above her door that said, "Know thyself." Part of the way that we reconnect with other people and grow in our relationships with them is simply by knowing ourselves, knowing why we feel the way we do, why we approach situations the way we do. And if you begin to do that work, you begin to process whether or not you have conflict, and you start to feel, well, maybe there is, you might ask the question, is there indeed a conflict that has been unresolved? Is there an ongoing relational fear that is causing you to run away from the people you love the most and that love you the most? I promise you that things can and will get better. You can go from a good relationship to a great relationship, or even a bad relationship to a great relationship, if you just do the hard work that it takes to restore and or to foster intimacy and vulnerability. And we, of all people, are able to do that because of what Jesus has done for us. I know John 3:16 is something I recite a lot. I know it's something that most of you are so familiar with, but it is the heart of the gospel. That God so loved the world that he gave his son to die for us. Not that we should be condemned, but so that we could have life. God is about life. God is not about judgment. God is not about beating us down. God is not about forcing us to live a way that is not best for us. God is about us living the best possible life that we can possibly have. And the way that we do that is through a relationship with Jesus Christ.